first, I'm joined by Lord Jonathan Sumption, retired Supreme Court Justice and one of the country's fiercest lockdown critics. Now, Lord Sumption, you wrote in the Telegraph yesterday that Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages, quotes, throw a harsh light on those involved. Their narcissism, their superficiality, their hypocrisies great and small. Above all, they show in embarrassing detail how completely power corrupts those who have it. Do you think Matt Hancock's behaviour was one of the worst abuses of power that we've witnessed in recent British political history?
Well, it was an abuse of power. Abuses of power are unfortunately very frequent. I'm not going to compare one with the other. I'd prefer to do without any of them.
But at the same time, they cast him and other ministers in a terrible light. There's this notion of government via WhatsApp, with the normal structure of government gone completely out of the window, knee-jerk decision-making, public policy being made on the hoof. I mean, where was the transparency and accountability? If it wasn't for these lockdown files, we'll never have known some of the decision-making behind unprecedented measures that affect our lives and civil liberties.
Yes. I mean, whatever you think about lockdowns, and it's a controversial issue, and I realise that not everyone's going to agree with my position on that, but whatever your view about the lockdowns themselves, what these files show is the complete disorganisation of the governmental process. This is classically a failure of government. The government took the original lockdown decision against the recorded advice of SAGE at the time. The whole government, and to some extent SAGE, then moved into propaganda mode and set about frightening people, partly in order to justify their decision and partly in order to force compliance. The result has been catastrophic collateral effects. But whether you agree with that or not, the governmental process was seriously defective. What it involved, or what it should have involved at any rate, was somebody to take a grip on the whole problem in the round, not just the clinical problem, not just the infection problem, but the economic problems, the educational problems, the social problems, the problems of mental health. And that never happened. I describe in my article Matt Hancock as a fanatic, because my definition of a fanatic is it's somebody who has only got room for one idea in his head at any one time. And that unfortunately characterized the whole of Matt Hancock's approach to this. He swatted away any kind of dissent. He refused to consider the examples of countries like Sweden, which had managed to avoid serious results without taking these drastic measures. He behaved in a way towards dissenters, like the unfortunate MP who nearly had his disability hub in his constituency cancelled because he threatened to vote against the tier system. This is an appalling way to conduct government, whether you agree with the outcome or not. The problem really is that you cannot have a system in which people are only looking at one aspect of the problem. All public policy is pluses and minuses, and you have to look at all of them. You cannot simply just look at half the problem and hope to solve it that way. And the blame I would put, not just on Matt Hancock, but on the Prime Minister, because it's traditional.
Yes, I was going to ask you about Boris Johnson. Yeah. I mean, you talked about a lack of grip. How would you analyse his behaviour?
The real problem is when you've got half a dozen different strands, some educational, some clinical and so on, you need somebody to draw the strands together and decide on the priorities and how you're going to reconcile these things and how you're going to perhaps relax some priorities in order to be able to give some effect to others. Now, that is classically the role of the Prime Minister. And what the lockdown files suggest is that in many ways, Boris Johnson's heart was in the right place. He does seem to have had an idea of the serious economic and social damage that was done by lockdowns. He does seem to have felt that there were times when we should have relaxed the lockdown much sooner. But he never really had the courage of his convictions. Because he never really got down to the details of the problem, he was too easily pushed about by advisors who had an agenda which was based almost entirely on public relations. And one of the things that the lockdown files very clearly show is that rather than following the science, essentially the government followed what it thought the public wanted. Now, in some contexts, that's perfectly admirable. But there are occasions when statesmanship consists in saying to the public, look, this is what you're asking for is a quick patch and the long-term consequences will be disastrous. That's something that a statesman ought to be able to do. And Boris Johnson was completely incapable of doing it. So he was always being pushed back into the box by his advisors, pushed back into the shape that they wanted him to be in. And in the end, therefore, nobody was in control of the most important aspect of the pandemic, which was to decide how we are going to compromise between the health priorities, the economic priorities, and the other things that we should really be caring about.
Lord Sumption, you also described the cabinet as a cabinet of mediocrity. Can you expand on that? Do you think that ministers these days just simply aren't up to scratch?
Well, I do think that. I did make it clear that I thought that there were exceptions to that. I mean, I think that Sunak and Gove, who took opposite views, as it happens, on the lockdown, are extremely talented individuals who would have an honourable place in any cabinet. But the problem about the cabinet as a whole is that it's been chosen primarily for its unconditional loyalty to Boris Johnson. And if you look back historically, you really have to go back to the early 1930s to find a cabinet so utterly devoid of talent as this one. I don't actually think that the quality of politicians has gone down, because I think that something like 2/3 of MPs have always been blockheads. But the great art of government is to choose your ministers from the others who are not blockheads. There are lots of talented people in politics. They're not in the cabinet. They certainly weren't in Boris Johnson's cabinet.
No, but then it sounds like you don't have much faith that so-called lessons have been learned from this pandemic. I mean, we can look to Sweden. We now hear from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who, as you know, was a lockdown hawk, praising Sweden for its response. I mean, how will we handle future pandemics, do you think? Any better?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, one of the problems in this area is it's very difficult when you have inflicted so much damage on a society to stand up and say, OK, we now realise it was a mistake. That's humanly very difficult to do. But I think it's actually unlikely, in spite of the fact that people are saying, OK, we did the right thing. I think it's unlikely they're going to do it again, even in comparable circumstances, because I think we've learnt an awful lot of detail about what was actually obvious from the outset, but we now have chapter and verse to show quite how much damage this has done, for example, to cancer sufferers, to old people who saw a huge spike in dementia, to children in particular, almost totally invulnerable themselves, but cooped up inside, deprived of education. Some of them will actually never recover. Some of them will. But, you know, this is a serious catastrophe in the making, and I think people are beginning to understand that. I doubt it'll happen again.
Lord Sumption, I'd be intrigued to know what your thinking is on the Gary Lineker row. Obviously, you may also have a view on the illegal immigration bill. What's your reaction to that story dominating the headlines this morning?
I'm not going to give you a reaction on that, because I don't think I should be sounding off on things without pretty carefully understanding them, and I haven't got properly boned up on that subject.
Do you mean Lineker or the immigration bill in itself?
Either. They're too closely related.
But then perhaps you have an opinion on whether the ECHR are going to block the legislation that's to be put before the House of Commons tomorrow, and whether it makes any difference. I mean, there's all of this talk about leaving the ECHR. What's your reaction?
The ECHR can't block UK legislation. All that it can do is to say this is inconsistent with the Convention, and in some cases it can award damages in favour of petitioners against the government for doing that. But it can't actually block the legislation. And if the legislation is passed, the judges in the UK will be bound to follow the legislation, even if it's inconsistent with the Convention.
But do you agree, finally, Lord Sumption, with this idea that human rights lawyers and other lawyers, I ask you as a lawyer, have been making it very difficult for the government to land any of these policies when it comes to controlling these 45,000 people who keep on landing on British shores in dinghies?
They obviously have been making it difficult for the government, but I don't think that one is entitled to complain if people make use of the law If you don't like the way that they're making use of the law, then you need to change the law, rather than criticise those who are doing their duty in allowing people to argue their side of the case.
Spoken like a true legal man. Thank you very much indeed, Lord Sumption, for joining me this morning.